Ever wonder what happens when the same royal bloodline keeps recycling itself for centuries? The answer is written in Deformities, mental illness, and horrifying medical conditions that brought entire dynasties to extinction. The cost of keeping the blood pure was paid in the currency of suffering. The year was 1700, and King Charles II of Spain lay dying in his palace. The last Habsburg ruler of Spain wasn't merely ill, he was a living testament to generations of catastrophic inbreeding. His autopsy report, rarely discussed in conventional history books, described a body so deformed it hardly seemed human. Charles possessed a jaw so severely protruded he couldn't chew food properly. His tongue was so oversized he could barely speak, constantly drooling as he struggled to communicate with his court. The royal physicians documented that the king's heart was the size of a peppercorn. His lungs corroded, his intestines rotten and gangrenous. He had a single testicle, black as coal, and his head was full of water. This wasn't just bad luck. This was the culmination of one of history's most disturbing experiments in genetic manipulation, royal inbreeding taken to its extreme. The Habsburg dynasty, once Europe's most powerful royal house, had practiced such intensive intermarriage that Charles II's genome was more tangled than a typical brother-sister incestuous relationship. His family tree resembled a circle more than a branching structure. The Spanish courtiers who attended Charles described his condition in private letters that revealed the true horror of his existence. By age 35, his body had completely broken down. He couldn't walk without assistance. His fragile skeleton couldn't support his weight. An examination of his skull, performed centuries later, revealed bone deformities so severe that eating was an excruciating ordeal. The king was effectively starving in a palace full of food. But the physical deformities were just the beginning. Charles suffered from seizures so violent that courtiers believed he was possessed. His intellectual capacity never developed beyond that of a child. Royal tutors documented their frustration at teaching him basic concepts. By adulthood, he could barely read or write, despite receiving the best education money could buy. The king who ruled an empire couldn't comprehend the documents he was signing. What's particularly disturbing is how the royal court attempted to hide these defects from the public. His portraits were carefully crafted propaganda, showing a dignified monarch instead of a reality, a drooling, hunched figure who often wore special devices to keep his jaw closed and his body upright. The gap between the royal image and the biological reality was a chasm filled with suffering. The genetic collapse of Charles II wasn't a sudden phenomenon. It was the result of calculated decisions across 16 generations. The Habsburg family coefficient of inbreeding reached 0.254, almost exactly what would occur in the offspring of two siblings. In modern genetic terms, nearly 25% of Charles's genes were identical copies inherited from both parents. For comparison, children of first cousins typically have a coefficient of only 0.0625. Looking back to the Habsburg line reveals a gradient of increasing horror. Charles's father, Philip IV, married his own niece. His grandparents were uncle and niece. His great-grandparents were first cousins. Generation after generation, the genetic dice were rolled with increasingly limited options. What emerged wasn't just a sick king, but a living embodiment of genetic collapse. Charles' reproductive system was as compromised as the rest of his body. His testicle, singular and described as black as coal in autopsy records, produced no viable sperm. Despite 2 marriages and desperate attempts to produce an heir, the king remained childless. The courtiers' diaries reveal increasingly bizarre fertility treatments attempted by royal physicians. Concoctions of ground deer antler, crushed gemstones, and various animal parts were all forced upon the king and his wives in futile attempts to spark conception. The true nightmare for Charles was consciousness. Unlike some inbred royals who suffered severe cognitive impairment, Charles maintained enough awareness to understand his own condition. Court documents reveal moments of startling lucidity when he would lament his inability to rule effectively or father children. "I am bewitched," he once declared to his council, "and they have given me something to render me impotent." The tragedy wasn't just physical deformity. It was the psychological torment of a man trapped in a collapsing genetic legacy. While Charles II represents the extreme endpoint, the pattern of royal inbreeding devastated numerous European dynasties. The Russian Romanovs, the British royal family, and virtually every major European house engaged in the practice to some degree. Queen Victoria of England, for example, married her first cousin Prince Albert, introducing the hemophilia gene that devastated royal families across Europe. When her hemophiliac descendants bled from minor cuts, they weren't experiencing random bad luck. They were suffering the consequences of calculated genetic narrowing. Perhaps most disturbing is how these genetic disasters were interpreted at the time. The repeated miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant deaths that plagued royal families weren't seen as warning signs but as mysterious curses or divine punishment. Royal physicians documented case after case of deformed royal infants who died within days or hours of birth. Those records, kept in various European archives, contain descriptions too graphic for conventional history books. Infants born with organs outside their bodies, missing limbs, or fatal neural tube defects that resulted directly from shared recessive genes. The medical understanding we have today transforms our view of royal history entirely. What was once portrayed as a series of unfortunate events or divine intervention is revealed to be a predictable genetic collapse. The royal disease wasn't mystical, it was measurable. A genetic analysis of 3,000 individuals across 20 generations of European royal families, conducted by researchers in 2019, found that inbreeding reduced cognitive capacity by an average of 10 IQ points in highly inbred royals. Some cases, like Charles II, were far more severe. The study also found increased rates of recessive genetic disorders at levels 40 times higher than the general population. The royal nurseries of Europe weren't just filled with future kings and queens, they were laboratories of genetic disaster. The consequences extended far beyond individual suffering. Charles II's condition directly led to the War of Spanish Succession, a conflict that killed over 400,000 people across Europe. His inability to produce an heir created a power vacuum that major powers rushed to fill. What's rarely discussed is how a preventable genetic collapse triggered a continental war. The political history taught in schools rarely connects these dots, how intentional inbreeding practices directly led to military conflicts that reshaped nations. The practice continued well into the modern era. King Alfonso XIII of Spain, ruling in the early 20th century, married a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. Their children suffered from hemophilia and other genetic disorders. Their son, Don Gonzalo, bled to death at age 19 after a minor car accident that would have left others with only bruises. This wasn't ancient history. This was happening when your grandparents were alive. What makes this history particularly relevant is how thoroughly it's been sanitized. Royal portraits, official histories, and even modern documentaries often gloss over or completely ignore the biological horror at the core of royal power. We're shown crowns and castles, not the grotesque consequences of genetic manipulation undertaken to preserve wealth and power within a tiny circle of families. The story of royal inbreeding isn't just about biological curiosity. It's about how power corrupts even basic survival instincts. These families had access to the best information of their time. They could observe the pattern of birth defects, infant mortality, and declining health in their own lineages. Yet they continued to practice generation after generation, sacrificing their own children's well-being on the altar of political consolidation. The next time you see romanticized portrayals of royal history, remember Charles II, drooling, unable to chew, his single blackened testicle failing to continue his line, his oversized tongue struggling to form words as his water-filled brain fought to comprehend his own existence. That's the true face of royal genetic manipulation, a self-inflicted collapse that ended dynasties not with glory, but with whimpers of biological